Good morning to everyone. Welcome. This is the A2Y Regional Chamber's online virtual edition of Early Edition, and we are very fortunate today to be with you via conference here. And I want to thank the University of Michigan and Mike Rain and Cynthia Wilbanks in particular for their sponsorship today and for all they do, obviously, within our community and as members of the chamber. We really appreciate their membership. We appreciate their involvement. And I think now more than ever, we see just what a foundational institution they are for this community. So thank you again to U of M for everything that they do. We will sort of proceed in a little bit different format than the traditional early edition, but I do want to give just a few quick announcements about some upcoming events. Next Tuesday at 11 a.m. Via Zoom, we will have a teletown hall with U.S. Senator Debbie Stabenow. She will provide us with the latest updates in terms of policy and so forth from D.C. We are looking forward to that. Again, that is next Tuesday at 11 a.m. That is free. Please share the information with fellow chamber members and your friends and so forth. And then next Thursday at 4 p.m., we will have Jeff Donofrio. He is the director of the Michigan Labor and Economic Opportunity Office. Jeff spoke with us back in December at a headline lunch, and he is going to give an update on the governor's 6-phase reopening program for businesses throughout the state. So we are excited to have Senator Stabenow and Director Donofrio next week. And on to today's program, obviously with the coronavirus pandemic, we have seen a unique set of complex and frankly unanticipated challenges that we are facing as a society and certainly in terms of our business community. And as we start to think about planning for reopenings, we certainly want to emphasize that the key component is the safety and health of the people who make our business community great. But as we look to reopen in a way that maximizes safety and health, we want to maintain those core functions of businesses while keeping employees and customers and communities safe. And these challenges can also be, in some ways, reframed as opportunities. And we have Scott Page with us today. And Scott has, I think, a rather wonderful and somewhat extensive introduction, but he is the John Seeley Brown Distinguished University Professor of Complexity, Social Science, and Management at the University of Michigan, and is the Williamson Family Professor of Business Administration at the Stephen M. Ross School of Business. Scott has a rather unique set of background and is going to talk to us a bit about how we make sense of some of the complexity going on today and how we do so in a way that maintains organizational function, a sense of purpose and meaning for employees, and the safety of all those involved. Scott will give his presentation, and then we will facilitate any Q&A. And so, Scott, with that said and out of the way, I want to thank you for being here. I want to welcome you, and I cede the virtual floor to you, sir.
All right. Thank you very, very much, Andy. And good morning, everyone. And just as a little bit of background, I'm a professor at the University of Michigan. I've been here for 20 years. I was a Michigan undergraduate. I'm originally from Yankee Springs, Michigan, and my family were small business owners. We had a gas station and ice cream store on a lake, on Gun Lake, Michigan in Yankee Springs. And then I went undergraduate here, got my master's at Wisconsin and my PhD from the Kellogg School at Northwestern. After that, I was a professor at Caltech, where I was kind of the unofficial economist for the Rose Bowl. And then about 20 years ago, I moved back here to Ann Arbor with my wife, Jenna Bednar, who's a professor, and we've raised our 2 kids and 5 dogs here in Ann Arbor. What I want to do today, really briefly, is talk about reopening. And the idea here is this, is that we're getting a lot of information about wiping things down, social distancing, that sort of stuff, and I want to give more of a systemic view. So what I want to do is I want to take, in some ways, a systems perspective. And the idea here, in my thinking about this is for kind of small to medium-sized businesses as well as some larger businesses. So the goal behind this, and this is in talking to a lot of people from the consulting world and the business world, is that when we think about reopening, we really have to have three things in mind. First, it's got to be safe. Second, we have to maintain productivity, right? Whatever our businesses do, our organizations do, we have to continue to be able to function. And the third thing is the work has to be meaningful. I think for all of our employees and our coworkers, if we're sitting at home in isolation and no longer part of a team, it's just going to kind of like suck the life out of us. And so there's a website here, and the slides are shared, that I've created that's a reopening toolkit that's just meant to introduce some of these ideas. So I want to talk about two things today: strategy, and I want to talk about implementation. I'm going to do these in reverse order. And the reason for this is I think the real kind of interesting part is the strategy part. And so we're going to tee that up. But as we think about, before we talk about strategy, it's important to think about implementation. Now, there's a website that I linked down here that was developed by a bunch of people in Seattle. So this is Microsoft, Amazon, places like that. They have a fabulous website that literally has probably 500 or 600 pages of documentation. So I'm going to give a slightly different spin on what they do. But when we think about implementation, we want to think of several things. We want to think about our team. We want to think about sequencing. We want to think about preparing our facilities, preparing our people, and then communicating. So let me quickly walk through that. Just once you have a plan, how important it's going to be to implement this in the right way. So let's start with the reopening team. When you get your team together, it's going to be incredibly important that you talk about what your goals are, whether you're a nail salon or a restaurant. And so, I've focused this on sort of safety, productivity, and meaningful work. But however it is that you're going to message it, it's incredibly important that your entire organization understands that whatever your mission was pre-COVID, it's now changed to include the safety dimension, maybe in sort of at levels and along sort of protocols that was never thought of before. Second thing, when you think about this reopening team, it's really important that your employees feel engaged, because employee safety and employee sense of safety, reducing employee fear, is going to be critical to have a team that can be productive. Okay, in terms of facilities, right? There's a lot of information on this, but wipe downs, barriers, spacings, how do you deal with doors and door handles, signage? This is a lot of just sort of the basic blocking and tackling. CDC, that reopening toolkit page I showed you before, there's a lot of places that have information about how to do this. But it's incredibly important that your facilities prepared and that people, both your employees and your customers, are aware that your facilities are now safe. In terms of people and routines, and this is a part that I find just fascinating to think about, is you want to think about how do you change some of the routines you've done in the past? How do you change the equipment people are using? How do you change meetings? Are they close contact? Are they socially distant? Do you make them virtual? Do you do a soft opening? One thing that a lot of organizations I've talked to have been thinking about doing is actually running a soft opening. If you're a hair salon or nail salon or a small restaurant, have your employees as customers. Run like just 1 hour of your workday. And then afterwards, have a virtual meeting where you sit down and you say, if people had time to reflect on it, how was it? Did you feel safe? Where can we improve? Where do we need new signs? Those sorts of things. Communication. Internally, before you open, it's very important that you communicate to all of your employees how you're opening, why you're opening, how things are going to change, what things are going to be the same. Internal signage is going to be incredibly important. Checklists are going to be important. One thing that the Amazon Microsoft group talked a lot about was, because this is kind of a new reality, having regularly timed updates in a common format is going to be really, really important, right? Because if people are just randomly getting emails and they're not sure, what's important, what's not important, they're going to be confused. So sort of saying every Monday, every Wednesday, every Friday at 9 o'clock, or every morning at 9 o'clock, there's going to be an email telling us exactly what's happening, what we need to do. That's going to be very, very important. In terms of communication externally, a lot of businesses, you're going to want to reach out to your core customers. If you've got an email list, and tell them you're reopening, how you're reopening, because them feeling safe coming into your establishment is going to be incredibly important. You want to redesign your web page that has a safety theme, and on that web page, you want to share your plan with your customers. And in your facility, in your store, in your warehouse, wherever it is that people are coming, you want to think about, do we have signs that make sense, right? So again, this is where you probably want to have some people come in and look at your signage. You know, you have X's on the floor. How are you communicating to external people so that they feel safe when they're in your place of work? Okay, so that's sort of the implementation. Implementation's a lot of, you know, thinking about communication, getting the facilities ready, getting people ready, getting your website ready, that sort of stuff. The deeper question, and the one that I've been spending the last couple of weeks, actually I guess now month, trying to think through is, how do you develop a strategy? How do you develop a plan? And by the way, if you have questions, feel free to chat, you know, type into the chat, and I can, I'm happy to sort of engage questions as we go. So what I want to do is I want to do two things. First, what I want to do is describe three frameworks. One is going to be called personal contact networks, like who is actually physically connected to someone else. The second are going to be what I call person-object networks, like what physical things am I picking up? Like we wouldn't want to all be sharing the same Polabic coffee cup. That wouldn't be a good thing. And then the third framework is going to be something called floor plan mapping, which is all of these are easy to do. All of these are just really good thinking tools to help you sort of see opportunities to make your workplace safer and to improve your work. And then the second thing I want to talk about, and Andy hinted at this, is that a lot of us are thinking about how do we make sort of marginal structural changes in what we're doing, right? Making things virtual to kind of continue to do things we were doing before. So it's almost like putting digital lipstick on an analog pig, as someone was describing the other day, right? We're trying to just make our current structure safe. One way to think about, one optimistic way to think about the particular situation is to say, this is an opportunity for transformative change. We have to do things differently. Maybe as we're changing things, we're going to see some real opportunities. And I think the businesses that really thrive at the end of this are going to be the ones that sort of, during this time of sort of extraordinary constraints, were able to make transformational change that gave them new markets, huge cost savings, improved the quality of the work that people had, and just sort of improved morale within the organizations. We'll talk about that near the end. Here's where I want to start, though. When we think about our strategy, we have to understand the disease. And this has been really frustrating, I think, for all of us. So let me tell you what I think we know. And if somebody else wants to chime in and say, no, Scott, that's wrong, great. But here's, as of yesterday, the best I can figure out from talking to experts about what we know. This virus, like all viruses, spreads in three possible ways. Aerosols, which is kind of through very small droplets, less than 5 microns in diameter, that are just sort of in the air. And these can spread past 6 feet in distance. They could just walk in a room, they're just kind of floating around. Second thing is droplets. These are the sort of bigger than 5 micron droplets of, like, you think of these almost like water droplets. And these are the ones that spread when we sneeze or cough, right? So within 6 feet. And then the third, this is a new word that's in many people's vocabulary now, fomite, which I love. Which fomite basically means, is it spreading on a surface? So when I say, here, could you go grab me a cup of coffee, and you grab it, there's little bits of the virus on the surface, and from that, you can pick up the virus. So then here's a question. Suppose I broke it down. What probability of people get it from aerosol? What probability get it from droplets? What probability get it from fomites? Now, originally, when I started looking into this, I thought, oh, this must be something they can figure out. And there's some studies on the flu where they literally create a simulated office and they test everyone and they can figure out what's the likelihood of getting it from each of these three things. It turns out that's a false question. It really doesn't have an answer. And the reason it doesn't have an answer is because it depends on our behavior. So if we're all wearing masks, the probability of getting it through droplets is much lower. If we've got an open airspace with lots of ventilation, the probability of getting it through aerosols are really low. If we're all washing our hands and wiping things down, the probability of getting it through fomites are really low. So what you want to think of is they're seeing sort of like a baseline probability of catching it from droplets, aerosols, and fomites. What they tend to say for this disease is that, you know, droplets seem the most likely, aerosols second most likely, and fomites kind of third most likely in terms of like what your risk is. But that makes sense, right? Somebody sneezing on you is more of a risk than it kind of being in the air than it is on people touching things. However, when we think about a strategy, our strategy has to work at all three levels, because the thing is we want to prevent all three of these mechanisms from passing the disease. I was talking to someone today, I was talking to someone from U of M Hospital yesterday, and said they've had very few cases within the hospital of transmission of disease. And that's because people are washing their hands, people are wearing masks, and they've got good ventilation. So we want to keep these three things in mind: aerosol, droplets, fomites. Those are going to be what drive every single part of the strategy. So here's our first framework: personal contact networks, right? We want to think about who's connected to whom, and this is going to be to reduce the droplet transmission of the disease. So let's think about how this works. Essentially, what you want to do is you just want to sort of like look at everybody in your organization and ask who is physically within 6 feet of everybody else. So this is just a small organization that's kind of hierarchical. The first person's directly, the person in the center, who might be the CEO, is connected to 6 managers, and each of those 6 managers may be connected to 6 people who go out and, like, you know, deliver things or something. And so what you've got is each person has some number of connections. But when you look at this graph, this entire graph is connected. So if any one person gets the disease, it could spread. If one of the green dots gets the disease, it could spread to their manager, it could spread to the CEO, then back to other managers, and everybody else could get it. So what you want to think about is for every single connection in your organization, there's 3 types of connections that might exist. One is sort of close and continual, right? Where we're within 6 feet of each other, maybe, you know, maybe wearing masks, but we're going to be near each other. There's nothing we can do about it. Maybe I'm holding a ladder for you, right? Maybe we're doing something as a team and we just have to be close. Second is distanced and occasional. So maybe we can meet outside, maybe we can stay 10 feet apart, maybe we can have 4 of us in a big conference room. And the third is virtual. So as we move down this hierarchy, what we get is, in some sense, safer and safer from the perspective of droplet or aerosol transformation. But let's go back to our goals: safe, functional, meaningful, right? Close isn't very safe. It's highly functional, right? And it's also really meaningful. Distancing is safe, but it's not as functional, somewhat meaningful. Virtual is really safe, but maybe not as functional and maybe not as meaningful. So there's trade-offs here, right? Here, though, is where this is one reason I got really interested in this, because I study complex systems. There's this interesting sort of paradox. When I think about safety, right, stopping the prevent of the disease, what I want is fewer connections. But when I think about productivity and meaningful work and an organization that's really thriving and vibrant, I think about more connections. And so then you could say, look, these things are absolutely at loggerheads. It's safety versus productivity and meaningful work. That is until you think about it a little bit deeper. We've got at Michigan, Mark Newman, Abigail Jacobs, Daniel Romero, Luis Simon. We've got a whole bunch of people who think really deeply about networks and transmission. And what you see is there actually isn't necessarily as much of a conflict as we might think. Let me show you why. Suppose you wanted to create a network that was unsafe. So let's call this the virus network. Then what you'd do is you'd have a whole bunch, you'd have 3 people maybe in a center and a hub, right? And then a whole bunch of people connected to them. And if anybody gets the disease, right, which is symbolized by this red dot, it's going to go into the hub. It's going to go into the 3 people who are connected. They're going to spread it, and they'll spread it to everybody else in the organization. So this is the kind of organizational structure that the disease would want. But suppose you wanted to create a space where people just had close friendships and felt meaning in work and, you know, felt a sense of belonging. Well, then what you might do is just create like little clusters of people, right? People would have a sense of meaning and people would feel happy. They'd be happy going to work. Well, this isn't a very good network for the virus. This is a great network for meaning, but it's not a great network for the virus, because if one person gets sick, maybe the people in their cluster get sick, but it doesn't spread to anybody else. It's also the case that within each cluster, there'd be a real esprit de corps, and people might take extra efforts to be safe because they don't want people in their cluster to get sick, just like you don't want people in your family to get sick. So the socially meaningful network is very different than the virus network. Well, then let's look at the productivity network. That's going to depend on what your organization does. So maybe over time, this is the structure of your organization. Well, if I look at this structure and I think about it from a disease perspective, it's not that great for the spread of the disease, which is a good thing, because if this person gets sick, it's going to start spreading this way, but you're going to hear about it. You can do what they call contact tracing, and you'll say, look, we've got a problem over here, and then you can sever connections and you can prevent it from spreading. So even though the disease wants contacts and your organizations wants contacts and your workers want contacts, it's not the same that they want the same type of contacts. So you want to think about, how do I use close, distant, and virtual connections to create meaning, to create productivity, but not to let the disease spread. So, for example, here's a bigger hierarchical organization, right? Each person's connected to 125 other people. Anyone gets the disease, it could spread through the organization. So what do you do? Well, one very obvious strategy is to think about making physical connections virtual. But you want to do this in a strategic way. So here's another organizational structure, right, that I just kind of copied off the web. If I look at this and think, okay, wow, the whole thing's connected. But look at the red lines. If I just take these 3 red connections, which are direct, and I make them virtual, I suddenly break the organization into 3 completely isolated groups. That's much, much safer. Now, maybe these other direct connections have to exist, right? I've got to have close physical connections for other types of safety reasons, right? Or it maybe takes 4 people to operate a machine. Just by wiping out 3 physical connections, I suddenly made this organization a lot safer. So rather than just say, okay, we've got to reduce all connections as much as possible, what you want to do is strategically think about which connections will allow the organization to still function, but which connections can I break to stop the spread of the disease? Second thing you want to think about, some of your tasks are going to be crucial tasks, right? So I was talking to Jerry Anderson from DTE about this. They have some very crucial tasks at DTE. And so one thing you want to do is you want to make sure those teams are very safe. So one thing some organizations are doing is creating alternative teams. So here I've drawn that same network, and now instead of using dotted lines, my son made little, who goes to art school, had me use these lightning bolts for virtual connections. So now I've got some virtual connections, so that's made the organization a lot safer. But where this C is, that group is doing something crucial, maybe running a power plant, right? It may be actually producing something that absolutely the rest of the organization needs. Well, what I might want to do is create an alternative group that can do that and wall them off, right? Maybe I'm having them completely work virtually, maybe I'm having them in a different location, and then just in case something goes wrong, right, with my crucial group, I can plug in the alternative group and the organization can continue to function. Okay, framework number 2, person-object networks. So we just talked about the person-person networks with droplets. Now let's think about person-object networks with fomites, right? This is sort of like when I touch something and it goes to something else. Here's what a simple thing you can do. You take all the people in your organization, you just ask them, what are the things you touch? Right? Do you go get supplies, the copier? Do you use the whiteboard? Do you visit the quiet room? Do you use this conference room? Just literally just have them write down all the things that they touch. Then what you can do is, if I've got the network of all the things people touch, I can then turn that into a network of people. So both person A and person B touch the copier. So I draw a line between A and B representing the copier. A whole bunch of people touch the whiteboard. And so in the graph to the left, I have lines between people who all touch the whiteboard. Once I see this person-object-person network, so these are 2 people are connected if they touch the same object, I get an obvious strategy. I want to remove objects to disconnect that graph. So in this particular picture, right, the whiteboard was a problem. And when I wipe out the whiteboard, right, so maybe I just go to Staples and I buy 3 whiteboards for people's offices instead of having one in the hallway, even though that was a place where a lot of ideas were shared. And now I've completely broken up that POP network, right, the person-object-person network, and I've reduced the spread of the disease to fomites. The reason this is so important is people don't realize what other people are touching things. So one of the studies on the flu, what I found fascinating is it turned out that when people walked down the hallway, they would stop and put their hands on the back of people's chairs as they talked to people. So the chairs were just crawling with the flu virus. So you really want to kind of have people understanding what is it that they're touching, what is it that they're using, and removing those things or buying personal versions of those things like coffee machines or individual supplies so that you don't get the spread of the disease. So this could be restroom keys, menus. I mean, I was joking with my family last night that 5 years from now, we'll be saying to people, there used to be these things called menus at restaurants, right? Because I think we're going to get rid of menus and we'll just use our phones. Because menus are just a horrible thing in terms of transfer of fomites, right? I touch this, you touch this, we pass it around. Okay, here's a key strategy. What was the first thing we did? We do networks of people to see who's contacting each other. What was the second thing we did? We do networks between people and objects and people to see who's indirectly connected to one another through these objects, like the coffee cup. Now what you want to do is combine those 2. Here's why. I could have a person-to-person network that's pretty disconnected and looks pretty safe on the left. I could have a person-object network that also looks pretty safe. So I could have followed all the guidelines. I'm wiping things down. I'm thinking, look, I've made a lot of stuff virtual. I've cleaned things up. But now when I combine those two, if I look at the network on the right, maybe it's your left, but the person-to-person plus the object network, what I see now is I've got a completely connected graph again. So I've suddenly got an unsafe work environment. So even though the droplet network is safe, the fomite network is safe, the droplet plus the fomite network doesn't look very safe. And that's why you've got to take the systems view. This is why, as someone who's a complex systems professor, I find this so fascinating and also see a lot of opportunity. All right, third framework, and then we'll kind of move on. Floor plan mapping. And this is, I think, one of the most sort of interesting things to think about because it handles droplets, fomites, and the aerosol possibility. So what you do is this. You can think about, okay, here's my office, and I'm going to make different people different dots. And I may have dots where they sit. I may have places where they go. And so I could look at this and I could say, wow, there's a small conference room down here in the corner with a little 2 in it where everybody uses that conference room. So I basically probably should say you can't use it. And I could realize, wow, this area by the bathroom and the coffee machine, everybody's going there. So even though I have socially distanced people, I've got these kind of hotspots. So how do we use this? Well, the first thing you want to do is you want to 6 feet your floor. So you want to use the floor plan map to just think in terms of droplets. Now, some people have done this in creative ways. Here's a cafe in Europe that I just loved. They had people wear these hats to sort of get them to realize, with swim noodles on them, to say, this is what 6 feet really means. If your swim noodle can touch somebody else, you're not staying 6 feet away. So here's a fabulous map by Newmark Knight Frank, where they take an organization and they look at the complete floor plan and they say, okay, let's just sit people down in all these spots so that everybody's 6 feet apart. So this would reduce the probability of droplet transmission, which is great. However, right, here's a famous map from a Korean call center. The blue squares are people who got the disease, right? And what you see is like the whole floor got it. And it happened really quickly. And so this probably happened through aerosol. If you look at the entire organizational floor plan, you'll see the other side of the office, almost no one got it. So now what you want to do is, instead of saying, okay, obviously they're violating the 6 foot rule, but you also want to think about aerosol transformation here. And you want then to create what is called a heat map. Okay, so this is another sort of really famous story about a Chinese restaurant where these are people sitting at the restaurant, and here's who got the disease. And what you see is that based on where the ventilation duct, you can see the air conditioner on the one side here, the way the air was flowing, everybody on that side of the room got the disease, and the people who weren't in the flow of the air didn't get it. So this is evidence that it's spreading by aerosol. And so the way to sort of look for this is to develop heat maps. So here again, also by Newmark Knight Frank, they take that same floor plan. An even better version of this would be to have airflow, if you know where the air ducts were. But they can look at particular areas and they can say, okay, these red areas that we've drawn are places where lots of people are coming and the air may be sitting there. Those are risky places. The orange ones, which are basically conference room, those are also risky places. So you've got kind of a 6 foot map and you've got the heat map, and both of these will help you figure out, how do I create a safe workspace for my employees? Okay, so those are our 3 tools, right? Person to person, person to object, floor plans, and they're helping us deal with droplets, aerosols, and fomites. Now I want to step way back just for 2 minutes, and then we'll open things up to questions. Is one thing that's very important to think about here is that a lot of these changes are marginal structural things, like, can I do what I was doing before by just changing something at the margin? Now we're meeting virtually as opposed to in person, versus thinking about this as an opportunity to possibly have some sort of transformative change in what we're doing, okay? So let's go back to these types of connections: close, distance, and virtual. This is kind of the marginal thinking that we do. So for example, when I showed you that map of, okay, here's how we used to meet before, I'm now going to take those, what were personal meetings, direct meetings, and make them virtual so that the disease doesn't spread as well. That's marginal thinking, and maybe you lose a little bit in functionality, maybe you lose a little bit in meaning, but nothing amazing is going to happen, okay? Let me give another example. So Michigan State, Stanford, Michigan, Wayne State, we all have seminars. So at these seminars, a whole bunch of economists at Michigan State get together and they attend a seminar. People at Stanford do, people at Michigan do, people at Wayne State do. These are direct, close personal interactions, 15 people in a room. Well, the marginal transformation we've made, the marginal change we've made has been to now meet virtually. So now each one of us is sitting in our home, like me, sitting in my basement, and I'm attending a seminar at the University of Michigan. And you can say, well, this isn't quite as good as it was before, right? We're now safe, but we've lost a little bit of functionality. We've also lost a little bit of meaning. But if you think for just a second, and this is my friend Fred Feinberg was talking about this the other day, he was talking to someone at Stanford, and the person at Stanford said, oh yeah, we're having a seminar on that tomorrow. And Fred said, hey, can I go to that seminar? It's virtual. And they said, sure. And so now when I think about it, I've got all these organizations running seminars, but they're virtual. There's no reason everybody can't go to everybody else's seminar. So instead of me being limited to the seminar at Michigan, now I can go to the Wayne State seminar. Now I can go to the Michigan State seminar, which I did last week, and I can go to the Stanford seminar. So suddenly, because I'm no longer meeting in the physical space and I'm meeting in the virtual space, I can have this transformative shift and I can actually learn a lot more. So suddenly I'm better off than I was before because I've sort of opened up the box of possibilities. Okay. So let me just reframe this one more time. When we think about marginal or structural changes, we think, okay, I've got this activity or this process, and I've got to decide, can I do this safely, and is it of high value? So here's a graph. There's versions of this graph I've seen this is, I think, from Deutsche Bank. McKinsey has this. Almost every consulting company has this sort of graph where you think, okay, on the one axis, I've got risk. How risky is this? And the other axis, I've got how important something is. And what I want to do is I want to do low risk, important things, right? I want to do low risk, essential things. When you think about transformative change, you want to say, okay, that mapping is yesterday's mapping. That's the mapping. What's low risk, right? And what's essential is based on the world as it was, not as the world as it's going to be. So instead of just asking, is this safe and is this high value? You can ask, what if I changed my culture? What if I changed the repertoires? What if I changed what people do? What if I prepare my facilities in a different way? What if I reorganize the nature of work? What if we learn how to do things differently? Well, now I might have something that was low value and risky, right? And after I've changed it, I've made it high value and not risky at all, right? And I was, somebody sent me this yesterday, which I asked people what ideas for my talk, and somebody sent me this. I thought it was great. Like, you can't hug your grandparents anymore. Well, you can. You just put up a lot of saran wrap, right? So this is, again, taking something that was very risky, making it non-risky, and making it really high value. So I think one of the real, opportunities here is just a change in mindset. And that mindset change, one pointer I'll give you, there's a great book by my chair at the university, is named after John Seeley Brown, who's a famous innovative thinker. He and Gillian Pendleton have this new book out called Design Unbound. And what they talk about is the whitewater world, which is a rapidly changing, hyper-connected, radically contingent world where everything's constantly in flux. So you could think about work like this, where everybody's kind of at their desk, doing their thing, following routines. Every day you get up, it's the same thing. A whitewater world is rapidly changing. You've got to work as a team. You've got to adapt to water currents. Here comes a waterfall. You've got to constantly be moving. What does that mean in terms of your practice as a business owner? First thing is this: situational awareness. Every day you've got to remind yourself, how does this spread? Close contact through droplets, airborne through aerosol, through objects. You need to be aware of what the science is saying about that, and how do you sort of make sure that your business and your organization is preventing the spread along all three dimensions. Second, look at the data. And this is I'm citing Fred Brown. Fred Brown, who many of you probably know, has a wonderful slide deck on this that I'm sure he'd share. You want to be also looking at the data in your region. So what is the virus level? What is the healthcare capacity? How much testing is there? You also want to be saying, what does the data say about individual risk? What do I know about age, health status, gender, family size, these sort of things? What sort of things might allow me to communicate to employees that they may be, or customers, that they may be at larger risk, and to change my operations for particular people based on the data? And then also in terms of activity, right? One of the things we know is the likelihood of getting the disease depends on the amount of exposure and the duration and the number of people who have it. And so you want to think about constantly keeping yourself abreast of what is the data saying about my local region and other things that I may want to change in response to that. Last thing on situational awareness is just your people, right? Do they feel safe? do they feel engaged? And you also then want to think about, are you leveraging all the information, knowledge, and talents that they have? Do they feel like, okay, this is a crucial time, we're all banded together, am I really being engaged and leveraged to make our organization work? Because the goal here, and this is what I teach at Michigan, is this notion of sort of collective intelligence, is how do we collectively come up with really good solutions to this? And what we know is you want to have multiple frameworks. You don't want to have one COVID model. You want to think in terms of people-to-people networks, people-to-object networks, formatting networks, and you want the frameworks you're using to match the nature of the problem: droplets, aerosols, fomi. You've also got to be continuously learning because the data is changing constantly, right? How risky an area is, how we know it, the mechanisms to which it spreads, early warning signs, treatments, all these things are constantly changing. So you're gonna have to be continuously learning and communicating. And then the last thing is, I talked about, and Fred Brown was talking about, like, this notion of sort of using the data, like staying constantly abreast of the big data. You also want to keep abreast of the thick data. By thick data, I mean thick descriptions. Sit down and talk to your employees. Sit down and talk to your customers and say, do you feel safe? How is your customer experience? Is this working? Have those deep, meaningful conversations, because the data leaves out a lot of the stuff that's most important. And so by combining big data and thick data, and if you type those two terms up, you'll find a bunch of nice articles about this, you can actually get to a much, much better strategy and also create much more meaningful work. All right, thank you very, very much. I'll stop the screen share and feel free to, hopefully a lot of time for questions.
Yeah, thank you. That was wonderful to think about, both in terms of how we apply it to our own office, but also from a systems perspective. That is certainly something that you are well versed in, and we appreciate it. We will open it up for any Q&A from our panelists, but I will get that ball rolling to say, Scott, a lot of what you have covered deals with contexts where you have multiple employees, maybe mid to large range. But I know that you've also put focus in terms of those small businesses. Is the framing thinking that you use around the value of an interaction and the relative risk and so forth, is that something we can scale from, say something like to a call center down to a 3-4 person shop?
Yeah, so let's take an ice cream store, right? Because that's something I'm familiar with, right? You've got a weekly schedule, and let's suppose you have 3 people working in the store. I can very quickly draw the person-to-person map and say who's working with whom, right? And even if they're wearing masks, they're within 6 feet of each other. So one of the things people have talked about is, okay, you should have, so one very quick thing you could do is you could say, instead of just having people work the schedules they work, that may very quickly get me a map where everybody's connected to everybody else. Instead, I might say, okay, I'm going to break you into 3 teams, and each team is going to work together always, right? Almost like, so remember when I showed you the slides of like the meaningful work, right? Like a bunch of little triangles that were completely isolated from one another and the virus couldn't spread. If I staff my ice cream store, if I staff my nail salon, if I staff my restaurant with teams that come in, and after each team leaves, there's a wipe down, I've essentially created meaningful work, right, and prevented the virus from spreading outside of each of those pods, right? That's why, like, just literally asking who's working with whom in physical close contact and asking, can I shift that? But this is where you've also got to have conversation with your employees, and you need engagement, because you need to make sure that their work schedules can fit around other parts of their lives, right? But one thing that people are finding, and this is a finding from social science more generally, is that if you do create these cohorts of like 4 people that always work together, they're going to take extra effort to be safe, because like the 4 of them are in it together, right? And they know if one of them messes up, all of them are at risk. And so you do create this, there is evidence of sort of strong cohort effects for things like cooperation. So absolutely, small businesses, you want to think about, I was talking to someone the other day about this, and someone hands out in this business every morning work papers to each of the managers. That's like, here, you get the disease, you get the disease, you get the disease. It's like, no, and something like that can be fixed so easily. Like the night before, she can type it out, right? Print it out and put it in folders. And if it sits there for 14 hours overnight, it's probably fine, right? So there's things like that for the small businesses, just literally thinking about who's touching something, who's working together. Where I think this is just absolutely, I think in some ways more important than the big businesses, because you can actually know because you have that knowledge, right?
Scott, I've got a question. Whether it's a small or medium business, what do you think the expectations from the owner, the management are as this new reality sets in? People are coming to work, the customers are returning, but the productivity has to rise slowly while they start this. What would you recommend to business owners in terms of their own expectations to be able to come back to full automation, productivity? How would you gauge that rise?
This is where, again, depending on how much time you have, the Seattle group really thought deeply in this, had a lot of conversations clearly about the sequencing. And one thing that, people who this isn't necessarily my area of expertise, but you could ask, how distant is my current is the behavior you need me to do in this sort of new reality versus my existing behavior? Like how different the protocols and routines going to be? The more different those are, the more slowly you've got to kind of onboard those things, right? So if I gave you a checklist of here's like 11 things you have to do, right, that you weren't doing before, that's going to be really difficult, right? But if there's only 2 or 3 things you need to do that are different, then I think you can imagine that you're going to be able to sort of, come back much faster, right?
Mm-hmm.
It also depends on, like the hospitals had very few cases, but these are people who are really good at following rules. I think one of the real challenges here is going to be each individual person. There's these ocean models of personality, like in terms of how open, how conscientious you are, right? I think that C term, the conscientious parameter, is going to really matter a lot. I think you're going to find some employees who are really good at washing their hands, wiping things down, not doing things. And there's other people who aren't, right? And I think depending on how large your organization is and how good your employees are, and also just what's the nature of the work, in terms of was it always super clean beforehand versus not, could matter. I was talking to someone about this who works in a warehouse, and one of their best workers is someone who's always helping everybody else, right? You need help with that box. Let me help you load this. Here, I can back this up for you, right? You've got to cut that person off at the knees, right? Because he's going to get everybody sick.
Yeah.
So there's things like that, and this is where even doing a soft opening where you have somebody watch is really useful. And from talking to people, you can imagine saying, okay, let's just run our nail salon for the, or our hair salon for the day, or just for 30 minutes. You 3 pretend to be customers. The 3 of you sit over here in chairs and just watch and take notes. And because, we're not even aware that I handed you the brush, right? Or can I borrow your shampoo? This sort of thing, right?
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Scott, I do want to let all our participants and attendees know we will make this available post-webinar today. And so far, just fantastic information. 2 questions that have come in. One is relatively easy, which is if you can just say again the difference between big and thick data.
Yeah, so if you type this into, this is a great, so if you just type big data and thick data into the web, you'll find a wonderful short article, but I'll send you some links. And then one of my colleagues at U of M, Yuan Ang, who studies Chinese politics, IBM asked her to write a piece on this. But here's the idea. Big data is kind of just all the stuff we can scrape from the web, right? So it's tons and tons of information. Thick data is, you can think of almost like an ethnography, where I sit down and really talk to someone and really try and understand what's going on. So you can think of this is almost like design thinking. Like, what was your experience? So for example, you might implement some program, have tons of data and saying, okay, here's who's using this and here's who's not using this. And you might come to some sort of inference about what you think is going on. But then we actually go and talk to someone, they may tell you a very different story. right? About why, what's happening, what's not happening, that sort of thing. So you could look at your data, you could look at your business and say, okay, things are down 10%, and looking at the customers, like I'm not getting anybody from outside of Ann Arbor, right? And you might not know why that's the case. Well, if you called people up from outside, or you might draw inferences from that, right? But if you called people up, you might find out that there's some completely other reason why, you might find out the real reason why what's going on. So the way I present this to my undergraduates is, imagine, I want to think of the world as existing in tons and tons of dimensions. So if you and I were good friends, like I would know all sorts about you and your motivations and why you do things and that sort of stuff. If the IRS gave me all of your your credit card data and what you buy, I still wouldn't know you. I wouldn't have a deep understanding of like why why do you go to Tio's instead of Big Ten Burrito? Right? I mean, like what, I just wouldn't know. But yet you do go to Tio's and not Big Ten Burrito. And I go to Big Ten Burrito about Tio's. Like only through thick data, only through deep conversations am I going to understand that, right? And so when you think about, you're going to see in the next couple of weeks, every business is going to see cash register receipts, those sorts of things. And that's going to be kind of like big data. Who's coming in? What are they buying? What has changed, right? That's just giving you, in some sense, dimensional reflections of a higher dimension, of a really thick reality. So then one thing you want to do is you want to call up customers that didn't come in and say, hey, we haven't come in. What can we do to make you feel safe? Or what services can we give you? And I think it's through that thick data, in addition to the big data, you're going to be able to make the transformative change, right? I mean, like Argus, like I've, I used to shop at Argus some of the time, farmer's market a lot of the time. I'm shopping at Argus all the time now because they've created this amazing way for me to go get groceries, right? Shop online. And that was, again, I think that they did a really good job of understanding their customer base.
So some of those high intensity efforts that produce, high level results in terms of customer interactions. Scott, one sort of two-part question. One is, we will again make this information available to our members. Any particular websites to go for data, we'd be interested and can follow up with you on to provide to the members too. But the other question that came in is, have you thought any about the temporal dimension for your networks? And this is really getting at, how do you build in the concept that folks might be asymptomatic for 5 to 7 days, and so that after you've had a meaningful connection with one group and then an isolation period, could you shift to a different group for a meaningful connection? What are your thoughts on some of the complexity over time that we have to account for?
Yeah, so when I chalk this up under continuous learning, so I kind of dropped the reopening webpage, and like within an hour, somebody emailed me and said, "No, you've got something terribly wrong." And I was like, "What?" And they said, if someone in a group tests positive, you don't want to contact trace. You want, because of the delay, you want to quarantine, right? So if somebody gets it, you then want to quarantine everybody they worked with at least for a couple days, and then get the test to them, because you don't want to say, okay, go get a test, because by the time they get the test, they could have infected 10 other people, right? So you want to, but again, we still don't even know. It's kind of amazing. We know you can spread if you're asymptomatic, right? But there's these classical models sort of have susceptible, exposed, infected, right? And so you could be exposed without possibly being able, without possibly infecting somebody else. So I think that the way to think about this is that, yeah, if somebody in a group has it, gets it, you want to, as quickly as possible, contact everybody that was in direct contact with them, that quarantine them, get them separated from their families, hopefully get a test to them, right? Or if you can't get a test, wait the 4 or 5 days, to see if they've got the symptoms. But and also then I think you can find out. You want to think like, how close a contact will they be in? I mean, were they in with the person? I mean, again, it's really, one of the things that's so frustrating, I think, for me and everybody thinking about this, is that if we knew just the likelihood of aerosol versus droplet versus fomite, right? We could have very different, because I could know, like, I touched the desk this person tests, I better quarantine. Or we could know, I touched the desk this person worked at, I'm almost surely safe, right? At this point, we just don't know that.
Understandable. And I think if we're listening between the lines to what you're saying, to some degree, we need to mentally build in a notion that this will take, one, some trial and error, and two, that our certainty level can never be 100% on some things. So it sounds like we need to adjust to those two realities. Is that right?
Yeah, and I'll send some links to some sites. There's a lot of them are in my reopening toolkit, but there's a great site by this person. It's Aaron. I'll type it in. It's like Aaron Brumbridge at UMass Dartmouth. And what Brumbridge does is says one way to think about this is it's the probability of getting it is the sort of like extent of your exposure times the duration. So if I'm like holding a bunch of stuff you're holding, I'm more likely to get it. If I'm in a room where it's in the aerosol for a long period of time, it's just, imagine you're kind of like just drinking water and there's a certain number of parts per billion of this virus. The more you sit there and drink, the more likely you are to get it. And this website that he created that's really pretty basic has like 16 or 17 million views, right? Which is amazing. But one of the things about it, though, is it's kind of saying, it's just giving you it's saying that's the probability. But, I was explaining this to someone the other day. It's like, if I say, what's the probability of making a basket? Well, if I take 60 shots from 2 feet away, I'm likely to make one, right? But it's also the case that if I'm standing 94 feet away, I could throw it and it could go in, right? So that's just giving you kind of like a baseline probability. You could get it from anything. And one of the things that where you see this tension between kind of economists and public health people is public health people are like, absolutely don't want anyone to get this disease. And economists tend to think in marginal, right? Like, well, what's the trade-off here? I think in messaging to your employees, it's dangerous to start talking in terms of trade-offs, because then they start thinking about you in terms of, okay, they're risking my well-being for profits. But the way you want to think in terms of trade-offs here is the following. You want to say, we only have so much capacity. You can't ask me to completely change how I do everything, right? There's just a limit. I mean, I'm human. And so what you want to ask is, can I develop protocols where I'm making this as safe as we can possibly make it? I'm creating checklists, signs, routines, reorganizing facilities, clustering the work, making things virtual in such a way that I'm making it as unlikely as possible that this spreads, yet at the same time not overwhelming you with too much information. I mean, again, let me use a metaphor from school. It's almost as though you're learning a different piece of music, but think of yourself like in 6th grade band, and all of a sudden it's like, here's a new piece of sheet music. Everybody's got to learn their parts, completely new parts, or learning a new, putting in a new offense in basketball. That doesn't happen overnight, right? But you're going to have to do it. You have to learn new spacing, those sorts of things.
Scott, maybe a good question then to end on is taking that from the theoretical to the practical. We had a question come in about a small 6-person firm that has made a good transition, a relatively easy transition to the virtual, right. But they're missing those daily interactions around the office, around group brainstorming in the conference room, meeting in person, so forth. And do you have any resource or organizational reference for an organization this size to look at the pros and cons of going back to a physical office space?
So I think that there's, 3 things that I would recommend there. One is, and this is one of my idea of a friend of mine, is that one thing you can do is you could say, okay, look, we're going to twice a week or 3 times, like every Monday morning and every Friday afternoon, or every Monday morning and Thursday afternoon, let's just all go out and do if there's only 6 of you, and do a spaced walk in groups of 3s, right? And we'll kind of mix, but let's stay, because again, the evidence seems to be that if we're 6 or 7 feet apart, we're out in the air, in the open air, aerosols unlikely, fomites impossible, droplets aren't likely because we're wearing masks, right? So the 6 of you could go out and kind of just, go for a walk in the Arboretum, go for a walk in Bird Hills, and have those conversations, right? So I think that for a group that size, absolutely do it, because there's a huge difference just being in someone's physical presence. I mean, so much of just of communication is nonverbal. Second thing you can do that I know some places have done is they've actually said, okay, once a week, we're going to try some different interactive software, right? So let's try Slack, let's try this. And each week you have someone kind of like, free up someone for a couple hours to like learn some way of learn something, some way of interacting. And then, then as a group, teaching the whole group to do it, just like we've all learned Zoom, and then figuring out, oh my gosh, for what we do, Slack is incredible. So Slack was actually originally part of a video game, and it's kind of like almost having it's kind of like a mix between chat and email. It's okay, but I know for some organizations, they found that like, we all just have Slack up all day, and we're all just working, and it's great, right? I mean, because we're all communicating. I'm saying, hey, anybody have an idea about this? And then like an hour later, somebody will have the idea, they'll type it in, and you just have all these different themes. So one thing is to play with different software and ask, is there different software? But for a group that small, absolutely just get out and see each other 6 feet apart in the open air. I mean, I hate to say that because there's then if somebody catches the disease, they're going to be like, Scott, caused me to get to it. But evidence is that that's very, very safe. Being outside, being 6 feet apart, wearing masks. And I would think that's so important because absolutely, this isn't the same, right, as in person.
Well, I've certainly enjoyed talking with you virtually today, Scott. I mean, I don't want to sell us short here. Thank you. We genuinely appreciate the information you've shared today, and we will make available the reopening website that you have in your presentations. Folks ask for that in the chat. We'll send it out. But we appreciate it, and if members have questions specific to this, do you have a particular web page up for you individually that maybe they could refer to?
Yeah, they can just email me I'm just scottipage@gmail. They can just email me, but put in the title something like A2 Chamber or something, because otherwise it might go to, because if it's coming from a business thing, it might go to spam. If you work for a ceiling fan company, I'll never get it, because like a few years ago I bought like 6 ceiling fans, and all I do is get anything with ceiling fan, and it's going to go to a spam folder. Otherwise,
Gotcha.
I should get it. The other thing I just like to say is that it's been my pleasure, and I think for all of us at the university and all of us in the community, I mean, the Ann Arbor business community has been spectacular, and the way they've responded, the innovativeness, and as we roll out of this, I'm looking forward to even, a better, more amazing Ann Arbor. And I can't tell you how many other academics I've talked to who said, boy, I wish I lived in Ann Arbor. If you're going to be quarantined anywhere, what an amazing place to be quarantined. And it's true, because we're getting arts, we're getting food, we're getting, we've got lots of green spaces, and the community's really held together here. And it's been an honor to just be part of it.
Well, we are fortunate as a chamber to be in the Ann Arbor Ypsilanti area and to have those resources available. One of those chief resources is University of Michigan. And Scott, we thank you for sharing the information with us today. To Mike Rain and to Cynthia Wilbanks and to the whole team at U of M, thank you for your sponsorship. And to our members, thank you for staying in touch, staying engaged, and staying informed through the web offerings that we are making. And we will have a very special one coming up on June 9th. Look for details on that. But Scott, one more time, thank you for being with us today. And to all of you, have a fantastic day, and we'll see you next week via Zoom for Senator Stabenow and Director Donna Frio, and have a fantastic Memorial Day weekend.
Thanks.